Hi and welcome to a new video. In this one we're going to be building an infinite scroll component with Django and React. Now if you'd like to follow along, you can just go to the DJ filter GitHub repository that we have, and here you can just download or clone this repository, and this is what we're going to be working out of in this tutorial. So once you have it set up here in your editor, you'll just need to create a virtual environment, install the Python dependencies and your node modules, which are explained in the README, and then we can get started. So I'm just going to open up these terminals here. You can see I have two, both with the virtual environment activated. And in this one, I'm going to run the server. And in this other one, I'm going to run the front end with npm run start. So this is what we ended off with in our DJ filter form series. And we're going to go ahead and create a new container, which we'll add as a root in its own view. So inside source containers, we'll just add infinite scroll results.js. We'll start off by importing React from React. And we'll also import Axios from Axios, which we'll need for our requests. And we're just going to create a class here, which we'll call infinite results, and we'll say that it extends react.pureComponent, and then we'll add a render method which will just return, let's just add a div for now, and then we'll just say export default infinite results, and we'll bring this here into our roots. So let's go here, say import infinite results from containers / infinite results. And then we'll just copy a path here. We'll set it as the component, and we'll just say infinite is the path, and let's save here as well. And so we can go and check this out here. So this is /infinite. So now we can get started with building this actual component. So we're going to need to store some state, which is going to be pretty similar to what we saw here in this form component, where we're storing an error, a loading, and the kind of results that we're going to fetch from the server. And we're also going to need to be clever about how we actually fetch results and notify the user when those results are finished or there's no more results to fetch from the server. So we're going to have a method that will load results from the server, so query it. And then we're also going to have to bind that inside our constructor. And probably most importantly is that if you want to build an infinite scroll component, then you're going to need to make use of the window.onScroll event, and we're going to bind that as well to the method that will call if you scroll to the bottom of the page. So we'll go ahead and just start with a constructor. So we just pass in props, and the first thing we do is call super of those props, and then we can assign this .state as an object, and we'll just say error, which is false. We'll add loading, which is also false. We'll add the journals, which will just be an empty array. And here we're going to add a couple other things which are needed for the concept of an infinite scroll. The first is the has more, or some way of storing when the server tells you that there's no more data to query. So we'll just say this is has more, so meaning has more data, which we'll set as true in the beginning so that it keeps on querying until that turns to false. And we're also going to store an offset and a limit. So the offset we'll set to 0 in the beginning, and the limit we'll just set to 20. Now this is just so that every time we query, we will increment the offset so that when we make another query, we're always changing the exact slice of the query set that we want. So it's always going to have, in this case, a length of 20 results that we'll query in one go. And so that is our state that we're going to be working with. Now we're going to need to work with the window.onScroll event. So if you just type window.onScroll, you can see it's an event, and we can make this a function like this. So it's going to be an anonymous function that will just call every time the onScroll event happens. And essentially what we want to do is we want to check if there is an error, we want to check if it's loading, and we want to check if has more is false. So basically if any of the conditions of these three change, then we're just going to say return. Again, this is happening every time you scroll. So those events will fire all the time. And otherwise, if all these variables are what they need to be in order to keep querying, then we will make a query. So what we're going to do is say constant state, and we can set this as an object here, which is going to be error loading and has more. And you're going to set this equal to this. So remember, we're grabbing state from this because we're calling it this.state. So that's how we're accessing that. And then what we can do is we can say if error, so if error is true, or loading, or not has more. So if any of these are true, then all we want to do is just say return. So that means that these conditions are basically going to check whether or not we are going to query. Otherwise, if this is okay, then we'll continue to the next thing. And this is just to check where the scroller is on the page. And you can also Google to find out if you're at the bottom of the page. But essentially what you do is you just call if document element dot scroll height minus document element dot scroll top is equal to document element dot client height. So if this is true, if this check is true, then we'll want to call some loading method, and there we can read it a little bit easier. And so this method we'll just call the load journals method. So what we do then is just call this dot load journals, and then this method we can come and place over here. So load journals again we'll create as a function, and immediately we're going to set the state of loading to true so that it looks like we're loading something. Then we'll just create an Axios request. Once we get the response, we change the state again based on what we've fetched from the server and to tell that loading is off now. And then we'll also catch any errors as well. So first let's go this.setState and we'll say loading is set to true. And we can also pass in a callback function, which we'll do like this. And here what we're going to do is grab the offset and the limit from the state so that we can pass that into our URL that we'll query. So we'll say constant offset and limit equal this.state. And then we'll call axios.get. And here we're going to pass in the URL, which will be to our local host. So 127.0.0.1, 8000, and we'll just call this infinite API. Then here we add in the query parameters. So we'll say limit equals to, let's say limit, and we'll say that the offset equals to offset, like that. So that's the URL that we query. Then we can say .then with the response that we get from that. We'll then say this.setState, and we'll basically set the journals to the current journals that we have plus the new journals we've received from the response. And then we'll increment the offset and we'll change loading to false. And then we'll also add in whether we have more data to query, which is something we'll also get from the server. So here, let's say constant new journals equal to response.data.journals. We'll say constant has more equals response.data.has more. And then here we can say set state of has more, and we'll say loading is now false. Then we'll say journals is a list of entries, which will be the current journals. So this.state.journals and also the new journals. And then we say offset is the current offset that we have plus the limit. So that will then increment our offset. And so then once we've gotten that, we can then say .catch, which will pass in an error. And we'll say this.setState and set the error equal to that error.message. And then we'll also say loading is false in that case. And so that is the load journals method. So that's going to fetch data. And we can actually call this a little bit easier. We don't need to say this.load journals. We can actually just bring this here into this object because we're accessing it from the this keyword. So we can access the load journals method, which is on the class, because it is this.load journals if we were to call it like that. So like this, you can then just call it without the this in front of it. And then we can call this load journals method when the component renders as well. So we'll say component will mount, and then we'll say this dot load journals. And so that's pretty much that. Now we can just render out our items here. And so we'll need to then wrap this in some brackets. And so this div, we're going to style it, and we'll say that the overflow y can be scroll, and we'll set flex equal to 1. And then we'll just add an h1, and it'll just say something like infinite journals. And we'll just say scroll down to load more. And then here we're going to map through our journals that come from the state. So we're going to need to access some of these variables. So we'll say constant error has more, the loading, and the journals, and say equals to this dot state. Then here we will map through those journals. So we'll say journals dot map for each j, and we're going to return this result component that we handled in the previous series. So we'll just import that, and that comes from components. So we'll render out that result, and all we need to do is pass the journal as j, and we can set the key as j.id. And then we can just add some conditional checks here for these three. So we'll output this dynamically and say if there's an error, then we're going to render a div, and in this div we'll just display that error message. So just like this. We'll do the same kind of logic for has more. So if has more is true, then we're going to say no more results. And this should actually be if not has more. So sorry, if has more is false, then we'll display that. And we can just remove that like that. And then otherwise, if loading is true, then we'll return just some text that says loading. We don't need to go and add a spinner, but we have shown how to do that in the previous series. And so there we go. That is the rendering method that is going to return this div. And so now we just need to make sure that we can actually get this data from our API. So if we take a look inside the core and then views, then if you scroll down, this is the view that we have at the moment, which is just a list API view, but we're not going to use this exact one. I'm just going to actually copy it, and we'll call this one the React Infinite view. And so the first thing to do is to remove this filter call, because we're not going to be filtering it in the same way, but we are going to need to filter the request.get parameters in the same way as how we were doing them here. So what I'm going to do is just define some methods above here. And this is basically just to get the limit and the offset get parameters from the request, and then to slice our journal query set based on those two parameters. So what we'll do is we'll just say define infinite filter, which is going to take in the request. We'll say the limit equals to request.get the limit, and then this one will be the offset. And then we can just say return journal.objects.all, and then we will slice it like this. So we want to go from the offset and then up until the offset plus the limit. So if we have an offset of 20, so to get from the 20th item in the list to the 40th item, then we would say from 20 to 20 plus 20, because the limit is 20. So it would be from offset to offset plus limit like this. And we just need to wrap this in int calls so that these aren't strings anymore. And then we can use this infinite filter here inside our get query set. So we'll say query set equals to infinite filter of self.request, and then return query set as it is now. However, if we take a look here, what we were doing is we were also getting the has more property, which we were getting here from our response.data. However, when we use the serializer just like this, the data is only going to contain a list of these journals. So what we want to do is basically override the response that's going to contain those journals, and also add in a has more key in that dictionary to be returned. And so the way that you can override what's actually returned in the response is by overriding the default method, and in this case it's a list API view, so that would be the list method, and all we need to do is pass in self and request. And so all we're doing is we're just going to return a response which will import from the REST framework. So this will be from REST framework dot response import response with a capital R, and we're going to return that at the end here. So we'll say return a response, and normally what you do is you're returning a serialized request. So we're going to use the serializer class on this list API view. We'll say that the serializer equals to self.serializer class, and there we pass in the query set, which we can just access with the get query set method. So we'll say here query set equals self.get query set, and then we pass this in over here, and we can just say many equals true. And this serializer would normally be passed into the response like that. That's what the default response would be, but now what we want to do is basically return a dictionary, and the first key is going to be the journals, which we already have here as the serializer data, and then the second one is the has more property, which we'll need to create a method for in order to determine what that value actually is. So we'll just go above here and we'll say define is there more data. So this is basically just going to take in the offset from the request.get, and we're going to check if that offset is greater than how many journal objects we have in the database. So meaning if the offset was 300 but you only have 100 journals, then you would have to return some kind of logic to say that there is no more data. So we'll say the offset is the request.get the offset, and then we'll say if the integer of that offset is greater than the journal.objects.all.count, so a count of all our entries, and if it is greater, then we're going to say return false, meaning that there's no more data, and otherwise we'll return true. So we can take that method and bring it here, and then just pass in self dot, or rather even request, because we're passing it in as an argument here. And so like that, we can then check if everything's running, and it is. So we'll just go into the browser and let's refresh this page, and let's check where the error is coming from. So it's saying there is no infinite API, and that's because we haven't brought this into the URLs. So I'll just go to DJ filter. Then here inside the URLs, we're going to import this view, and I'm just going to copy this here, and this one will be infinite API, which will use the React infinite view, and then we'll just say this is infinite React, and so everything is working. So let's go to the browser, refresh this, and we see we're getting a status code 500. So let's just go back and see here. It says your manager object has no attribute all, which is coming from this line here. We can see there's a typo, so this is meant to be .all. And if we try this again, there we can see the loading took place, and we're only returning the first 20 items, hence the scroll bar. But if you scroll down, now you can see that it is fetching more data as it's getting to the bottom of the page. And if we keep scrolling, eventually we'll get to the end and we see no more results. So our infinite scroll is working. We're fetching the data in a more effective way by only getting the exact entries we want, which is with this offset and limit key that we're passing in. And so if you've enjoyed this video, then make sure to leave a comment down below. Let us know what you thought. And otherwise, thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.